Okay, let's get some more insight into exactly how these tariffs could affect the global economy. I'm joined now by Professor Ravi Ramamurti from Birmingham, Alabama. He is director for the Center for Emerging Markets in Northeastern University. Thanks very much for joining us today. We certainly appreciate it. A lot to cover. Let's focus on, to the surprise of, I guess, virtually no one who follows Donald Trump, he is pushing forward on these punishing tariffs, despite so much pushback from economists and allies abroad. We're talking about the two largest economies in the world. If indeed, as China has maintained, there's not going to be a winner in the trade war, how do you see this playing out?
Well, I think the U.S. realizes this is a lose-lose proposition. It's not a win-lose proposition. But the U.S. is hoping that the losses for China will be bigger than the losses for the U.S. Now, this is, of course, a dangerous strategy because at the end of the day, both parties are going to lose. And you're hoping that the other party will buckle because of fears of losing even more than the U.S.
Okay, we're seeing some of President Trump. He was speaking last night, and he said that the United States, quote, holds all the cards. If indeed that is true, and what you said is true about the way the U.S. is pursuing this, how long can China cope with these tit-for-tat sanctions?
I'm not sure the U.S. is holding all the cards. I think that's a nice position to broadcast publicly. But the U.S. does have some advantages. It's a very large market for China. China, therefore, depends on the U.S. to sell a lot of its exports. And the U.S. is growing rapidly, faster than some of the other countries, and even picking up some pace, which makes the U.S. even more important. But China has some important bargaining leverage. Let's not forget that a lot of the U.S. exports to China are more commodity-like than Chinese exports to the U.S. And it's much easier to put a tariff against a commodity like soybeans or pork or something like that than to put a tariff against a manufactured input. So, and China is a sole supplier or a major supplier for many inputs coming into the U.S. So as you start to go down the list and get to bigger items and more items, it will actually be hard for the U.S. to impose tariffs that hurt China without hurting somebody in the U.S. So I think that's why you're seeing that even the escalation that is happening on the U.S. side is not as rapid as you might suspect, even though President Trump has said that eventually the tariffs could be applied to all $500 billion worth of products from China. The next round of tariffs is only supposed to apply to $16 billion worth of exports coming into the U.S. And it indicates that it's really hard to find products tariffs on which will hurt China without hurting somebody in the U.S.
Right, and that's one thing I want to focus on. In a global economy where parts of a phone or a car or a computer are built in various countries, who are going to be the big losers in all of this? We know that U.S. farmers are already feeling the pinch.
Right. I think consumers will eventually feel the pinch. Right now, because the initial list of products is designed to not directly affect consumers, but intermediate inputs, those will eventually find their way into finished products and therefore will affect U.S. consumers. But it'll also affect U.S. manufacturers who use those inputs to compete globally. Because as you said, supply chains are globally interconnected these days. And that's one reason we expect trade wars not to actually take off. Because if I can hurt you, you can hurt me back, then we don't want to have a trade war. And I think that is still very much true. I don't think that has changed. And therefore, it will begin to affect more jobs in the U.S. than is currently the case.
Real quickly, what about Russia and so many of the U.S. allies? How do you see this moving forward?
Well, I think there's a possibility that many of these countries will get together and file complaints at the WTO. Now, even though the WTO process is slow, it does eventually work its way. It may take a year or longer to work its way forward. But each of these countries has got some room to hurt the U.S. back in retaliation. The question is whether the U.S. can take retaliation by multiple countries. And even if each one of them is a pinprick, together they can add up to a significant effect. And let's not forget that in the U.S., the elections are really not that far away. And therefore, I think President Trump would really like to get this whole thing resolved very quickly and to be able to claim a win on this front.
Great.
But I don't see that happening very easily, though.
Or quickly. Professor Ravi Ramamurti, thank you very much for joining us from Birmingham, Alabama.